All right, so there we go. Hello, everybody. Wow, this is not a live interview. We're sort of cheating a little bit, but I am extremely honored. Well, go ahead and introduce my esteemed guest. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. I'm not sure about esteemed, but I'm Dan Felder. I'm currently a lead designer at Electronic Arts as of this recording. And I have been in the game industry for a good number of years. I've worked on some fantastic projects. My current one, I really can't talk about. I've sort of helped shepherd it from just a team of like a few people on figuring out whiteboard concepts into full production. So that's really exciting. I've worked on Hearthstone before, several different expansions. My favorite one was the Boomsday project, which was a huge amount of fun. And I worked on a digital card game called Faeria. But my favorite things to work on are always tabletop role-playing games. I actually learned game design from tabletop role-playing games because I realized I wanted to work in game design and start figuring out how to teach myself what I wanted to do when I was in college. And one of the things I like to do a lot is I like to figure out how to learn. I spend as much time on my design process and my education process as I do on actual design. I like to really think about, how do I design my ability to design? What does my flow look like? What's my pipeline? How am I effectively surfacing problems and solving them? Can I think about problems in more constructive ways? Can I organize my information better to surface issues before it happens? And so I always am thinking about that type of flow. And when I was trying to solve this problem of how to learn game design, I realized one of the biggest issues was people were going into college for game programs and making like 3 total games over the course of the entire program because it just takes that long to like code something. So I thought, well, how do we solve this in other industries? We do it in genetics. It's all about iterations. And so you study fruit flies, you study things with really short lifespans. And so when you have that, you can really get quickly a lot of understanding about whether your thing is working or not and how to improve on that. Also, outliers is another good example. The famous 10,000 hours thing. People don't realize it's not work on something for 10,000 hours. If you read the book, it's work on something for 10,000 hours with constant feedback as to whether what you're doing is good or not. And so within that perspective, I started thinking about, okay, how can I make games this incredibly quickly? And I started thinking about Dungeons and Dragons and similar games as a game engine, more like Unity versus a game. Because like, hey, I can build narrative design of this. I can do level design in dungeons. I can do combat design. I can do boss design. I can do quest design. I can do system design. I can do anything. I can just playtest it this week. And so I started playtesting 5 hours of content twice a week, running games at college, and just trying to test out game design theories. Like I'd go read up on Legend of Zelda dungeon theory and then build a dungeon based off of it. I would read off on, reward loops, and they would build a loot system based off of it. And so within all that, that was supposed to just be something I did to get me into the industry. But to this point, I still constantly work on side projects and role-playing games. I love it too much to stop. So that's my long introduction about my history with role-playing games.
No, that is there are a couple of fascinating points in there. The idea of thinking of, tabletop role-playing games as the engine to test lots of bits of game design that's really crucial right there. Because folks tend to think of, role-playing games as really, really complicated. But compared to, building a computer system from scratch, lots of it's done. Like once you know the rules, your brain is doing most of the lifting, right? So just like you said, you can get lots of iteration and lots of different elements of design through this one engine. That's a really great insight.
Yeah, I think it's actually by far the best thing. If you want to learn game design, you want to test out your games as quickly as possible. And so I recommend for all new game designers, even if they already know how to make computer games, is if you want to get better at game design, what you do is you hack board games and you hack tabletop role-playing games. Take Monopoly, which we all like to make fun of, and say, okay, well, you're the new lead designer of Monopoly. Make it better. What's Monopoly 2 look like? Make one change to the rules and make it better. Can you do that?
We're gonna time out right there. What is it? Give me the answer. What's your one change to Monopoly to make it better?
Honestly, I don't even know what it would be. Like, there's so many different things. I haven't done that project yet. But one thing I would do is I would start attacking the major issues. One thing is playtime. Monopoly takes way too long to finish. Now, if you play it with the correct rules, it turns out it doesn't take nearly as long. Which is when you land on a property, it goes up for auction and anybody can buy it. But that's one of the major issues. Another element probably is the certainty of there's a dominant strategy once you know what the best properties are and what the things are, that it's always the same.
Yeah, buy the orange ones with 4 houses. Yeah.
Right. And so like there is some really valuable properties for good ROI, and it's very much up for RNG whether you're going to spend them or not. So because the auction rules, I would basically make it either that they all go up for auction for everybody at the start, whether you land on them or not. And you might just get a commission if somebody else buys it instead of you. Or I would probably look into something that maybe shuffles the property values around a little bit. Like Settlers of Catan changes the economy every single time you play. Also, some amount of interactivity between players would be something I'd want to look into, and some alternate strategies besides just the main draw. But then maybe we're going too complicated. So this is just off the top of my head. But I look at attacking playtime, I'd look on attacking predictability, and I'd look on attacking excitement and thrill. And also I'd like to get into some of those more financial strategy theming, like whether if you could figure out, some sort of fun loan mechanics where you could decide to take a big loan and try to do something with it, and that might come back to hurt you in the future. That might start to laser into the theme elements there. But that's a fun exercise. So we just right now, we were just having a bit of a brainstorm.
Great. So I just want to, so looping back into there's a few things that I noticed that go back to your first comment, right? That you said you spent a lot of time thinking about almost like this metacognition, right? How do I improve the process of game design? Like if I can build a process, I can reiterate that process, I can improve the process and get better results. So something that I really noticed just right there in that quick like spitball exercise is how quickly you're able to identify problems and then think about, okay, what can we do in the mechanics that actually address those problems? So that was just, really fascinating to talk to. But, oh man, so how did you get into the video game industry, like being a game designer? Like that's the end of the rainbow for a whole lot of folks.
Sure.
Do you have like some sort of insight or some tricks you might want to share with folks?
Yeah, sure. The very first thing I want to say is that first, if you want to come to the industry, awesome. We're glad to have you. But I do want to say one thing that I think is very important, and then I'll tell you how I did it. So don't worry, I'm not going to get out of that. But basically that there's a lot of pressure in like the world, but especially like American culture, that if you love something, you have to make money out of it for some reason, which I don't agree with at all. Like a lot of the times you get into these AAA companies like I've been at with Electronic Arts and Blizzard and stuff, even indie ones, you got to understand you're getting some additional cool stuff and really awesome resources to work with. But ultimately you're going to be beholden to certain business goals. It's going to be more like, we're going to say, let's say you love gardening and you love just planting plants, seeing them grow. And the AAA video game equivalent is like mass factory farming. So it's a very different emotional experience and a very different day to day. It's a lot harder. It's a lot challenging. You can, have a much, much bigger impact on people. People have literally written to me that I've never met saying that playing some of my games have like literally gotten them through an incredibly dark time, maybe saved their lives. A lot of people have written saying they wish I was dead. That happens too. But basically that's an amazing thing you have. It's amazing to have players just care so much about what you're putting into the world, that in other industries, you don't get that. People don't care about what you do in your day-to-day. Here, they care immensely. So that's wonderful. But I want to say is I have brilliant friends who I would hire in a heartbeat to be game designers who just know that they love it as a hobby. They love having full creative control, working on it when they want to work on it, working what they want to work on, having no concerns about target markets or business model or any number of that stuff or viability, and just being able to do what they love. If you love game design, you can do it as a hobby, and it's great. It's a hobby that might make you a little bit of money instead of a hobby that's going to just cost you infinite amounts of money, which a lot of us have. So I want to say that. Don't feel like you're failing if you're not in the industry. When people say like I'm a real game designer or something, I'm like, no, anybody who designs a game is a game designer. That's the rule. Only criteria. So I just wanted to make that point. The next thing is let's talk about how I did it. There is a technique that I used that several of my friends have used now, which is very reliable. And I don't hear people talk about it that much. So I want to just quickly lay it out. Nobody will hire you for game design, especially at a cool company, unless they're confident you can already do the job. That's because we don't really care, especially at the bigger companies, about like how, this is super my opinion, but basically our incentive is just like in the industry, we care less about having the best person for the job, largely speaking, as we do about making sure we're not hiring someone who will mess things up. Because if you're working on a team even of just 20 people, which is a reasonable size, but very small team, a lot of game teams are 100, 300 people, etc. Each one of those people is going to cost about, let's say, $10,000 to $15,000 a month for their salary, their healthcare, their equipment, all that stuff.
Insurance, yada, yada, yeah.
Yeah. let's say you mess up on a 2-year project a little bit and you delay the launch of something by a month. The cost of that is enormous because it's just insane. If you start doing the math, it's going to be multiples of your entire annual salary. And then if you had marketing planned for that month, that costs maybe millions of dollars, and that's going to get blown out because the game's not ready yet. Like, little mistakes can have giant outputs, so nobody really wants to take a chance on anyone. That's why you see these horrible like entry-level jobs, like entry level must have 5 years experience. Makes no sense. So, but what you can do though to get around that, you just have to make sure that they're familiar with your work already. You can do this in several ways. If you try to go up to somebody as a designer or something and you say, hey, I want to show you my work for the game, for your game, I think I can do good work. That's not going to work very well. Also, it's a legal liability to look at your ideas often. But what you can do is what I did, what several of my friends have done after I coached them through it, which is first, ask to play test their game. You see, that's the thing.
You're doing them a favor. They'll love that.
Yeah, exactly. Say, can I play test your game? And they're like, yes, I have need for that. And what do playtesters do? They comment on their experience and they can say what they think would be better. And now you're reading their feedback. And so a lot of playtest feedback is utterly terrible, completely self-contradictory and insane, but I don't care because my goal is just to figure out what was your experience like. Mm-hmm. You might self-diagnose completely wrong. Like if I go to a doctor and I say, hey, my stomach kind of hurts, or my leg hurts after I ran 2 miles. I think I have cancer. Like, a lot of doctors make jokes about this. But the thing is, the leg still hurts. The stomach still hurts. So in playtesting, you can't argue with someone that they were having fun because their argument doesn't make sense.
Yes.
But what that means is if you give good, insightful designer feedback that is actionable and polite and is useful to them, and you say, I had this problem, I think it's because of this, I think here's how I would fix it, and I say, that's good, I just noticed that over and over again, and guess what? That's the job a designer does. And so I went to a game developers conference, I met a bunch of different people, one of them had a game that I could play test that was an alpha. I asked if they needed play testers, and they said yes, and I wrote them a ton of feedback about their rules, their card design, what was working really well, definitely want to focus on that, and also what was undermining that, what was not working well, other opportunities to make that better, and they loved it. And the issue was, though, they said that they didn't have time to work on it right now because they were still doing some funding stuff. And so I said, well, do you mind if I make a paper prototype and play it with my friends? And they said, sure. And so I did that, and I playtested my new ideas, and I sent them a detailed playtest report. We went back and forth for a few iterations. And then ultimately I said, hey, I've got to stop. This is important. You can't do free work forever because they have no impetus to hire you at this point. You have to eventually say, once you're convinced they know what your work is worth, and this happened to be true for me as well, I could say, hey, I've got to stop and focus on my job search. And for me, I luckily had an internship I was about to start at Fantasy Flight Games. And so that's why I had to stop working with them. And so they said, can we offer you an internship? Immediately. Never a hint I was going to get an internship offer before I was suggesting I would stop giving them this value. And then because why would they? I mean, it's not being evil. It's just, I'm right now a playtester that's being very helpful. But now they're about to lose my work, so there's value happening here. And this is an impetus for them to want to retain me. So I said, well, I'm already doing an internship. They said, well, could we offer you a job? And so we set up a job for me basically after my internship. And that's how I got in the game industry. It was a really, really fun story. And my friends have done similar stuff. Start with playtesting, meet local indie groups, get them used to your work, and you can do it. My current project has a collaborator that was playtesting my game. He thought it was awesome. He wrote me great feedback, and I said, you want to help me work on it? Like, that's what's going on.
All right. So yeah, we'll circle back to the playtesting in a second, because there's a whole bunch I want to talk about there. But maybe you can tell a bit like what's your day-to-day role as a senior designer? Like, what do you like do when you go into the office or into the Zoom calls or
sure
those sorts of things?
Yeah, it's been Zoom for a while now. All right, I'll try to keep this answer more brief. I have a lot of thoughts on how to get in the game industry. It's a question I get asked a lot. So my day-to-day is totally different based on what type of production we're in. When we're in like early ideation brainstorming mode, it would be just me and a few people on a whiteboard just trying to solve a big problem. What I like to do normally is, so here's a way to explain.
Like, what's that level of abstraction look like when you're like whiteboarding? Like, we want you to be an RPG, we're getting armor and weapons, and the weapons get more powerful. We want you to get more skills, or
this is a really good
explore. Like,
this is a really good question. So it helps to understand how seniority works in game design. And it's different in every studio, but usually it works like this. The lower you are, the more direction you need. So an associate level designer is usually hired just to be design muscle. Basically, like, I don't have time to build all the things, but I know what needs to be built. And so you're going to come in and you're going to build like things with very extensive design documentation that's exactly like this, that fits exactly this box with these design goals and these things. And within that, you're going to have some freedom to interpret those goals how you want to, because I didn't have time to do that. Then the mid-level designer is going to be someone so that's like associate level. Then like game designer or game designer 2, there's a mid-level, which is much more like, hey, we need you to come up with like, a level, one level within this large game, probably not the most important level, but like a level. Can you design a level? And it's a series of content that might then get handed off to associates to fill in the gap. Or they might do it themselves, depending on the size of the team. And so it's a larger responsibility, but that level will have, say, it'll be level 3, and it has to introduce this item, and it has to do this, and it has to have this feel, and you're going to be working with these general art assets and something like that. Okay. And so then the senior level is somebody who pretty much you basically say, can you make us a combat system? That's the only direction you get. And it's basically, you work with the design director, the design lead to kind of shape what the vision of the game is from player experience level. But as your designer, you basically lock them in a room, you slide a sandwich under the door every now and then, and they come out with a huge chunk of the game. And they come out saying, this is how all the levels in our game will work, largely speaking. And then they work on the most important ones. And then at the lead to director level, you're focusing more on interfacing with other disciplines and being a voice for design to other people, like you working with artists and talking about the art vision for the game and how that links to the game design. And you're defining the box to say, like, for example, when I was on my current project, basically they said, hey, you 3 people, me and my producer partner and like engineer and art director. So it was 3 to 4, depending on the time. The start, it was basically like, we need another game. Tell us what we should make, and then we'll tell you why we shouldn't make it. And that's the way it should go, because you need to have that thing. And so we were basically like, all right, well, what's our studio good at? What does the market want? Let's look at this. Let's look at that. Like, what do we think would be cool to make? And so we have to kind of define that box to play in. And so that's how it really works. And my day-to-day, because I'm currently in a lead position, but basically I spend a lot of time working with other disciplines, a lot of time being a voice for design with art and helping navigate the vision to say, all right, so here's the type of effects that we want for this IP. Is it going to be something more over the top and explosive like anime? Is it going to be something more mundane and muted because we want to emphasize the low desperation of the game? Or is it going to be something that's more welcoming and sparkly and has this kind of fairy tale vibe? There's a lot of ways you can do it, and they don't all work for the same thing. Sometimes you'll get a really over the top, explosive, amazing FX for an ability, and it looks awesome. And it's like, guys, this is like a basic attack. It's not an ultimate. Like it doesn't work. We can't mix this together. For example, when I was in Hearthstone, we were doing voice acting recording. Not me, but we were doing it with like the voice actors. Like, we had Matt Mercer in there, and we had all sorts of these great people. He's on my DM screen, by the way. That was nice. Basically, like we wrote dialogue for the characters and they're reading them, and we're having to give information to the director, like, we can't have a really extended death sequence because often like a bunch of characters die all at the same time. And so they'll all get mangled. They have to just play really fast. So you can't really do a 3-part death of, it has to be much faster. In other games, it's the opposite. It's a boss dying. We're gonna have a long cinematic. You want this to linger. So there's a lot of that game design logic that ties all those pieces together at the higher levels.
All right, so you're more responsible for like overall, that ludonarrative harmony, right?
Sure.
Mixing that with tone. Like we have a tone for this project that we want, and how are we going to marry our individual pieces of mechanics to fit that tone, to fit the story and game we're trying to play?
Yeah, for like the last year and a half, I've been much more focusing on that higher level and like managing the pipeline and sort of mentoring, working with other designers to help execute on that. And then doing a lot of like the highest stakes stuff myself, to the point where basically if something's really important, like maybe that'll I basically am in a situation right now where it's like half contribution and half like lead. So half my work is more broad, working with other people and overseeing and shaping narrative and shaping how all of everything fits together. And the other half is like, all right, I'm going to work out this piece of the game myself. And that's, I like to have that mix. It's a lot of fun.
This is actually a really good segue into talking about playtesting, right?
Sure.
So eventually you have to make these big decisions, right? Like, okay, we're going to do a combat system that utilizes bullet time, or we're going to use a combat system that lets you pause and adjust your inventory versus one that's not. How do you make those really big decisions without getting any playtest feedback? Because until you make those big calls and actually start working on the project, you really can't get any idea of what's going to work. So once you make those big calls, like how do you make those big calls and what's the next step after them?
So basically, it's very useful to think about playtesting less as playing a game to see if it's fun and more as science. You're trying to test and validate hypotheses. So what we try to do is we try to isolate there's playtests that exist for the team and there's playtests that exist for like a showcase. And so the early playtests, we often try to come up with like, what are our biggest questions that we need to answer and what are the highest risk questions? Because if something's like, there are some questions that if we're wrong on a hypothesis, it just doesn't matter. Like there's a very safe backup. Like let's say, for example, we're building, I don't know, like a card game, right? Or let's just go to tabletop role-playing games, actually. Let's say we're doing tabletop role-playing games and I have an idea for a new cool class. And it's awesome. And it's going to be this really cool hybrid of multiple types. It has a unique mechanic and the mechanic might not work. But on the other hand, if it doesn't work and playtesting, we can just go, I have like 2 or 3 safety mechanics that I know will work. In which case I want to test early if this mechanic's going to work so that we don't build a lot of content around that mechanic. But if it doesn't work, I'm not too afraid. So normally what we try to do is we try to do a playtest as quickly as possible, often called a gray box, where basically it's named so because the whole game is basically just gray boxes. And you've got like little capsules for the characters and no animation or anything. If it's a shooter game, you'll just see like a little red square be fired out. And the whole goal is just with as little effort as possible and making it clear to anybody looking at this is not a final game as possible. Like, is this mechanic a good idea? And so we try to put it through the ring, we try to figure it out. And then if we get confidence in it, then we can build out from there. How do you test before you have playtesting? Like, how do you have confidence in something before you have playtesting? There's 2 techniques I like to use. One is I'm a big fan of always starting with design goals, starting with like, what type of ultimate player feeling are you trying to do? I like to say that gameplay makes you feel a thought. And so the idea is, what are we trying to make you feel? What is the fantasy here? And how can I make that, not just intellectual, but make you actually feel it? Like I have a side project that's just a tabletop role-playing game that just got into playtesting literally yesterday. And that game is all about a mix of like Shadow of the Colossus and Monster Hunter. And it's supposed to make you feel this tense, exciting, thrilling action of trying to attack monsters. And so it's built on kind of a press your luck underlying dice game from a lot of games I love growing up. There's games like Pass the Pigs and Zombie Dice.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. And so I want to take that. And I thought, well, I want the sense of tension and excitement and everyone being like on the edge of the table, looking what you're going to do. And I decided, let's just make that the action economy. So basically you have one action on your turn to do a thing, either climbing on the monster or attacking. But if you want, you can press your luck. And there's a chance that it goes horribly, like a critical failure style thing. The monster gets an extra attack. Or you might get a free action and then you can press it again, but now the odds are scarier. And so it's like playing blackjack versus a dragon. And so like that has worked great. It created that sense of tension. And so when I want to playtest that game, I just tested the action economy really quickly with a friend over 5 minutes. And we said, let's try to do a thing. Let's try this. Let's try this. Is this feeling fun? Okay, great. Let's build the game around it.
So having really well-defined goals and a really strong sense of what you're trying to accomplish is really going to lead you towards those initial decisions, which can then get play tested and iterated on.
Right. So you want to either go to other games that already are proven to do the type of feeling that you're thinking of. And that often is not in your genre. Often the best stuff comes from other genres. That's often why people think I'm creative at work, because I'll say, what about this solution? And it's like, no one's ever done this before. And I'm like, they have, just not in this genre. Like Game Boy games were doing this 20 years ago, but it's the same thing. It's the same solution. And so I actually like to go outside of games entirely.
Dread is the most brilliant RPG ever made, in my opinion.
Which was?
You know, the one where you build the Jenga tower and like you have to take
Oh
the
yeah,
off?
yeah, Dread. Yeah, absolutely.
That's
Dread's a
the
perfect
most
example.
brilliant game in 40 years. I love
Perfect
it.
example of that. Jenga builds a sense of escalating tension and dread of it falling. Just take that, plug it into an RPG. So that's where a lot of great ideas come from. You identify your design goal and you identify another thing that gets you that goal, and you just plug it in. And so you can have a high confidence that's going to work because you know how this works over here, and you just have to be good enough at design to see that it'll still work over here. That's a very learned skill. Quick recommendation: before you play test something, mentally visualize it playing in your head, like try to play the game in your head and see it go, and see if you can predict how it's going to turn out, then play test it and see if you were right. Just keep building that skill. It's a skill that I spent the last 6 years building. And now I can mostly look at a design and instantly see how it plays. I'm wrong sometimes, but I'm right more than I used to be, let's just say. Now.
So when you're going about play testing, like how do you collect feedback? Like what does that look like? And
Sure.
how do you evaluate what's the good feedback and what's like junk?
Yeah. So the thing that I would say is it's very easy to listen to what they're saying, but not why they're saying it. And that's often when you get wrong. Playtesters, you'll often get a playtest report that's something like, this boss was way too hard. It was super overpowered and we killed it in a round. It was so boring. And it's and no one even took damage. And you're like, excuse me? Can you, these things make no sense together. And so you get that feedback. But the thing is, there's often a grain of truth there. But what are they getting at? I say the boss was overpowered and it was insane, but we killed it, was too hard, it was boring. It was what can we, I often want to ask them questions. I mostly just want to immediately say, why did it feel overpowered? What about it was too strong, And often you end up finding that basically it was this big, crazy, debilitating effects that locked people down, prevented them from taking actions, and it was really frustrating, and that felt overpowered. But the monster had really low health because it was supposed to stop you from damaging it, and then you killed it, and it just died as a one hit. And maybe that sounded good in your head. Maybe it's cool as a fun puzzle style monster, but it seemed like the players weren't having fun. It was very easy to read that sort of report and just instantly say, this guy's an idiot. But that's not the case. The case is that you've got to look at the symptom, not just what the patient is saying their illness is. And so I always like to ask a few questions. I don't ask that many, and then I just let them talk and I try to figure out what they're seeing. The first is, what was confusing to you? And I like to say, and I like to phrase it that way, not were you ever confused? Because players often go, no, I wasn't. That feels bad if I was confused. I like to phrase the question in a way that assumes confusion. That's very important. It says, what was the most confusing to you about this? Is a really good way. They will definitely pick something if you say, what was the most confusing to you about this? And then because what you're really looking for is, if things are confusing, that's not good. We always want to smooth out confusion. The next thing is, when were you the most bored during the game? Because boredom, that's not good. Let's try to get some stuff there. And then if I have a specific theme in mind, like monster hunting, for example, did you feel like Epic Monster Hunters playing this? And they might say, yes, it was awesome. Or they might say something like, well, no, I didn't really feel like, the Shadow of the Colossus style thing. This felt much more like a Witcher slow preparation thing. And maybe that's cool. And if the game is accidentally doing that, maybe I redo the game around that cool thing. Or maybe I say, well, that's not the goal. Let's try to move back this way. And then I like to ask, what were your biggest positive moments that stand out and why? What were your biggest negative moments in the game that stood out and why? And then I ask final thoughts, questions of fantasy. So confusion, boredom, positive, negative, theme, and anything else. And those are the questions I'd like to surface that are the most useful.
Okay. So that's that bit about confusion, something that really jumped out at me, because I was doing the playtest feedback for Galder's Gazetteer.
Mm-hmm.
The way this works,
by the way.
Oh yeah, thank you. Books out by that on Drive-Thru RPG right now.
Yeah, it was really funny. I saw I was up from Zipperon Games, and I was like, oh, I know Zipperon. He has cool content. I wonder if that's a more general phrase than I thought, because they're using it too. And then I realized it was you, and I was like, oh my
god. Champion.
Yeah.
So the way that the playtest worked is we sent out the playtest packets, and then Michael O'Connor, from Think DM, he was going through all that feedback, right? And then he was serving as the voice of the customer and then saying, okay, here's what people are saying. And something that we learned pretty quickly is that sometimes people will give us feedback based on a completely wrong assumption, right? They're saying, oh, this mechanic works like this, and I was doing it this way, and this makes it completely busted. But in fact, they were using it incorrectly.
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean that playtestor is an idiot. It means that we phrase that mechanic in a confusing way.
Yes.
And so,
so important.
Yeah, understanding that whenever someone's taking the time to tell you something, they're not doing it because they want you to fail. They're doing it because they care about your project, right?
Yes, and that's incredibly important. I would say some people actually do want you to fail, but that's just because it's the internet.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like a playtester really has it out for you, just don't engage with them too much. But see if you can make them useful. But to your point, like that is the most important thing in game design. Actually, that you've just nailed it, which is whenever possible, assume it's your fault. Like if something is confusing, don't just say, well, they played it wrong. Say, well, what can we do to reduce the chance they'll play it wrong? It's one reason that actually there's a trick we do in user testing with like tools creators at work, and it's done a lot, which is you do user testing, but often if you just give them a written report of like the user test, they're like, God, these people are idiots. So make them read the manual. Whereas if you make them watch, they watching people spend so long looking for the save button, even for like 2 minutes, and they're just like, it hurts so much, and you're not allowed to tell them that you just feel this empathy and this impulse to make it easier for them. And so one thing that I loved, this is too much for a lot of groups to do, but over Zoom it's becoming more reasonable, is there's a God, what's it called? So Pandemic Legacy is one of the biggest games that's come out in a while. There's a great GDC talk on that, which they had almost all their playtesters film their playtests, and then they watched it, which is a absurd amount of time spent watching that. But they said that was amazing for them. And so honestly, if you can just be a silent observer in a playtest, like on a Zoom call or something, that's great. You would do a fancy flight games called blind playtesting, and you'd sit there and you have to watch people play it, and you weren't allowed to say anything.
Oh man, I would love that. That would have been awesome.
Yeah, it's so great, and it so hurts, but it's delightful. So yeah, if you can get people to do a Zoom call, play it, sit and say nothing. If you can't do that, at least if you can play, that's fine. But like whatever people think the rules are, don't correct them and go along with it yourself. And that's not as good as pure blind, but it's because people kind of look to you, that they'll sort of assume that if you're not objecting, it's part of it. But if you can get people to play test and just record it and then send it to you, and you can just watch it. And that is immensely, immensely valuable. So yeah, I think you've hit a very key point.
So a lot of people talk about play testing. I mean, for computer games or video games, finding bugs is obviously a huge thing. Things can like literally break the game and things don't work. Mm-hmm. But aside from bugs, the other thing that folks are always obsessed about is this idea of balance. And you've worked both on like single player RPGs and like competitive fantasy like Hearthstone and stuff like that.
Yep.
So when you're trying to decide what something is balanced or not, like what's your thoughts on that? Really big question.
Yeah. It's a really big question. I could jump into my 1 hour talk that I gave to EA on this. But basically,
here's the Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, I'm trying to condense. So the most important thing I would say is that everybody cares mostly, let's talk about the biases. When you're a new designer, especially a new indie designer for tabletop role-playing games, you're going to be caring about balance too much. There is a right amount to care about it, and there's a right time to care about it, and your impulse is too much. And this is because when you're a player of a game, most of what you're doing is trying to solve the balance question. You're trying to get the most powerful thing. You're trying to you're in the competitive scene. So all your focus is mostly on balance. And in the discussions about the game, we talk about tier lists. We talk about which subclass is the most powerful. We talk about all this stuff. So we're always talking about balance. So it seems very important to us as players. And it is extremely important, but not in the way people think and not the time people think. Balancing, I do last. When I first start working on a project, I always start by sort of I want to get close enough to the point that I can kind of squint and see the fun. Because if something isn't fun when it's, if something is fun when it's overpowered, it might still be fun when it's balanced. If something isn't fun when it's overpowered, it probably isn't going to be fun when it's balanced. So I often try to build out a very big baseline, just eyeball how strong I think something should be. I'll maybe build a super light equation of like how long do I want the battle to take. I'm building a new system. Like, all right, I want about 5 rounds, give monster 100 hit points. Hunters deal about 20 damage per round. done. Like, and we'll just start there, and that might not be great, but we'll figure that out later. Because the thing is, balance has so many ripple effects, so many things can change it, that every time you change a rule of your game or a feature of your subclass, all the other stuff can ripple out and just get messed up. So often you want to play test it, get it fun, and then when you don't want to change anything else, then you really carefully balance it and you worry about half a damage or something else. Another thing I want to point out is, I actually remember I was talking to the head of Fantasy Flight Games role-playing stuff when I was there, and I was talking about him about one of my systems that I worked on. And I was so proud as a new designer at the time about how perfectly balanced it was. And I was talking constantly about like, so like, you know, we've done this optimization test, we've done all this stuff like that. Nobody can get more than 10% above the average or below the average as long as they're doing this stuff. And he said, okay, super, super polite. And he was super great about it, but he really made the point, people don't really get excited about a class because it's going to do 5% more damage than the average. I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting point. And I started, and he said, yeah, because when people are reading these things, you want them to read your feature, and then they need to get excited about it. And they need to feel like their choices matter. And they need to, you know, feel like they're making the right decision. And so, look, if I just taken the normal thing, I'd only be doing this much damage, but I took this other cooler ability with this drawback, it doesn't really matter. I could actually minimize it, and I feel smart. Aren't the game designers stupid? And players like to feel superior to the game designers. So basically, the way that I often describe it is that when everything's perfectly balanced, it's like a multiple choice question where everything equals 3. Like there's no actual difference. There are things about
balance is different than symmetry.
Yes, that's very true. And so what I like to say is that you can define balance by it being the opposite of broken. I like to say that your game has a script, that there is a ideal form of the game that you kind of imagine, like, okay, we're going to start by, you know, talk about League of Legends. We're like a good League of Legends game goes off, and we're going to start by, you know, farming on the edges of the lanes, and we're going to gain some XP, and then we're going to get into a fight or two, and someone's going to die, and we're going to spark of XP, and we have to try to counter that. Then we're going to start getting our ultimates, and we're going to start building up. Then we get into full team fights, and it just builds over the course. Now, an overpowered character would be something that could say rush the Nexus, which is the home goal, at the start of the game and instantly destroy it. And it's like, that's not what's supposed to happen. Somebody that could avoid any farming at the start and just go straight for assassinations might be broken, because that would break the flow of what's supposed to happen in the game. You should have games that have exceptions, and weird, crazy stuff should happen to keep it fun, because in small doses, variety beats quality. But basically, overall, that's the flow of the game. And so if you look at games where things break, like you have an insta win on turn 1 in Magic the Gathering or something, that's because that's not how Magic the Gathering game is supposed to go. You're supposed to have some setup, some, you know, rising action, a climax, and then some falling action, people desperately trying to survive. And so when you're thinking about that, anything that breaks that is broken gameplay. It's not really about how powerful it is. A good example I like to give is, like, I can tell you a card that would make Magic the Gathering, like, it'd be the most broken card in the history of Magic the Gathering, and it would have a perfect 50% win rate, which is this. If this card is in your deck, at the start of the game, flip a coin. Heads you win, tails you lose.
Yeah.
Perfect win rate. Like, it's the most balanced thing ever. But obviously, it destroys the script more than anything ever else has.
I need a second to recover from that. That's man. All right, so just a quick anecdote. I was on a play test last night with DM Scotty from DM Scott. I don't know if you watch the channel. He's like one of the OG D&D YouTubers. He does all sorts of mini terrain.
It's awesome.
Wonderful guy too. And he is making an RPG system all his own, right? And his philosophy is, okay, I want to make it as simple as possible, the most rules light available. And he started off by saying, okay, let's imagine what's the simplest case scenario. That the whole RPG is you just flip a coin, heads you succeed, tails you fail, right? And again, that's going to be broken because it breaks the script. You're not having any meaningful choice. You're not having a whole lot of attention there. And so he just built off of that a little, that key goals. Okay, this is not quite enough. Let's go keep getting step from that, see what we can end up with.
Yeah, that's a really good approach, by the way. Is one of my favorite things when I'm working on a design is I like to throw all my ideas and create the too crazy version. But then I like to say, all right, now what's the too simple version? What about this is not quite enough? Because I liken it to, imagine trying to get the perfect amount of wood for like a house on a roof. You could do it like most game designers do, which is throw on about 30 feet of wood and then just start trying to eyeball and figure out what you can rip off and then rip stuff off. Or you could do it by making maybe just a little bit too much to keep the roof from leaking and then see where it leaks and patch it. And so that is much more efficient because it really teaches you a lot more about what matters in your game and what doesn't. When you have so much stuff going on, often actually having more complexity reduces player strategy. It doesn't help. It doesn't add player strategy because each one of these systems matters so little that you can afford to sacrifice almost any of them. Whereas if you only have a few tools to work with, those tools matter immensely. And so you have to start figuring out how to maximize them and how to get the most value out of them. I have a lot of examples of that from Faeria. We had more complex versions of the game that had much shallower strategy than the simpler versions of the game. Because complexity and depth are totally two different things. But one thing I want to say about balance before we get into any other topic, maybe that topic, is that when you're working on balance for your game, one, focus on the first question. Is what you're making fun? Or is it fitting? When I say fun, what I don't really mean is fun, I mean, is it sort of fulfilling your design goals for the player experience? Do they feel like an insane necromancer? Do they feel like a raging barbarian? Do they feel like they are a big, powerful character? Or do they feel like a tense, terrified, desperate character slowly trying to eke out a living dungeon crawling, which is the theme for another game I'm playing a lot called Trophy. And in that game, oh my God, you feel the desperation. It's great. And so focus on your design goal first, then try to find mechanics that will fit that goal that are proven from other games that you can lift or build them off cognitive science principles about how humans think and feel. Cognitive science is by far the best thing you can be studying. And there's a great book called The Gamer's Brain. Highly, highly recommend that. But basically then you go into balancing and you say, based on some super general math, or just eyeball and gut feel, because you can always, when you're playtesting, just change it. Because you can say, what do I think is the right number for this? And then once you have that sort of right number, you can say, all right, this is gonna be close enough. I'm gonna boost it up a little. And that's actually what you wanna do. You wanna start a little too powerful, especially with any new content to an existing system. You always wanna start a little too powerful. Because if people don't wanna play your system, or try out your new content in the first place, rather, then you're never going to get playtesting. And also, like I was saying, if something isn't fun when it's overpowered, it's not like say 10 to 20%, 30%. Don't do like 2 or anything. Don't do 2x or anything, but just go a little over the top. Then
but it's not fun when it's overpowered. It's definitely not going to be fun when it's back in line.
Yeah. The last thing I'd want to say about that is there's a great technique I have called triple tapping, which basically I like to, if you try to aim for the perfect balance with theory crafting, you almost never get there. So you start a little too powerful, and then you say, all right, sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes it's nowhere near strong enough. Sometimes you are factoring in a whole bunch of stuff, like the time value of damage. I was talking to a group earlier about this thing that often gets totally ignored in turn-based game design. And so basically you start a little too powerful, or what you think is too powerful. And then maybe you say, all right, this is doing 10 damage. Playtesting says it should actually be doing 8, like it's doing too little damage, it turns out. It's not proccing often enough. It doesn't have the drawback is bigger than I thought it was, whatever. It needs to do more damage. I think it'll need to do about 15 damage. I buff it to 20 damage, maybe 25 damage, not 15. And the reason is because if I buff it to 15 damage and it's still too weak, I still have infinite numbers more to go. If I go 10 and then 20 and I'm still too weak, I got there faster. And if I'm correct about it, that I'm too strong, I've now tested that hypothesis a little bit, and I have a low point and I have a high point, and I have a lot of information about where that third point should be.
Yeah, you bracketed it.
Yeah, it's called triple tapping. It's like shoot, 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 and then the third shot you land there. It's the best way to minimize iterations.
Excellent. All right. I mean, there's so much more I want to talk about. We're kind of running. Time is flying here. So there's this, I'm going to sort of throw one out at you here, something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I sort of want to get a different opinion on it. I've been thinking a lot about the role of randomness in game design, right? With tabletop RPGs, you're sort of limited. It's like, okay, platonic solids plus something, or percentile dice plus something. You're pretty limited there. But with computer games and video games, there is a whole lot more tools you can use, right? You can have randomness have whatever effect you want.
Yes.
So it's just sort of like, how do you square that? Like, how do you determine random damage and random assortments of things happening with playtesting feedback? Like, how do you square those two things?
So
Because
it's
one,
funny
you want consistent, scientific,
Mhm.
few variables as possible, and one is actually saying no, it has to be different each time. It has to be unpredictable.
So there's several. This is an incredibly interesting question. It's a really important one, and a lot of it's going to determine what your personal design goals are. Because one thing about becoming higher level in game design, when you first start getting into associate level, the big break between that and being a casual person is learning principles of game design. You start learning about things like complexity points, and you start learning about things like design goals and persistent imbalance, and all the sorts of things. Then you start getting to mid-level. You kind of isolate, from the internet pop culture theory and the good intuition about what's good for like the real solid predictable things about what's actually going to be good. Then for anything above mid-level, you start learning how much each of these things actually matters. Like, because like a lot of people will do something like, I think actually a great example is Joseph Anderson. Joseph Anderson does these amazing video game deep dive and critiques about like they're like 2 hours and they're phenomenal, and he'll break down frame data on like bosses in Dark Souls, and you just learn so much about the game by watching his breakdowns. But what he often messes up, in my opinion, is that he's very willing to basically critique a sushi restaurant by critiquing its chopsticks. And it's very much like he'll talk about this one piece of the game that objectively seems bad based on his theory, and therefore the game is not good. And even though people love it, which is an indication that his theory is not great. Because if people love something and your theory doesn't explain that, you're basically like saying, this rock should fly according to my theory. Nature, you should design better. And that's an unfair, truncated version. He has a brilliant videos. I highly recommend checking them out, actually. Because like what he focuses on, it's unbelievable. I've never seen anybody go deeper. I'm sure there's somebody somewhere, but I haven't seen it. But the reason I bring that up is there's a lot of people that say RNG is bad because it limits player agency, and I've heard player agency is good, therefore anything in the RNG is bad. And it's like, no, losing agency hurts a little, but it can gain you other things like excitement, like variety, which are good things. And so often in game design, you have to figure out your trades about your design goals and about what am I going to pay to gain something else. Sometimes you figure out ways to just gain, and it's amazing. But often you have to accept some sacrifices here to gain something else over here. And learning which trade-offs are for which things is actually very much what the leads have to do. They have to very much say of a project, our creative pillars are focusing on these things. We care about these categories more than anything else. We'll sacrifice other things to get them. And so that's what you have to focus on.
It's just like, I cannot imagine something in Hearthstone having a variable that's 1d10 plus 2, right? Like,
right.
People would freak out about that.
Exactly. And so there's a lot about using randomness, right? It's funny you said the role of randomness, because I actually was like, I think I wrote it. Yeah, I did. I just checked. I wrote an article called Design 101, the role of randomness. I'll link it to you later. But basically, it's very important. There's several different pieces to RNG. RNG is fundamentally about not knowing an outcome. All games to some degree have to have some unknown outcomes in order to make the game not be a puzzle. This can just be, some games solve it differently. Go has no RNG. It solves it entirely via possibility space. There's so much possibility and there's so many viable moves that you're never going to play the same game twice. You watch like top Go tournaments, you never see like game to game. The board always looks different by the end. It's amazing. Other games use dice. Other games use various things. But basically RNG does a lot of things. It creates variety. And variety is useful for skill in a really interesting way, because if I can memorize what the right answer is, then I can piggyback with somebody else's skill. It's very easy to make a character build in D&D where there is no RNG that is as good as the best character build, because you could just copy it. Whereas playing in D&D, often things are very different from encounter to encounter, adventure to adventure, and it's a huge test of skill because there's so much variance. Now, some of that is a variance that feels controlled because the adventure is designed differently, but some of it is based off of the randomness over any number of fights and so on. One major element, though, about randomness is how are you using it in your game? For playtesting, you're not going to get enough good playtesting data in a small sample size to really, figure out if something's powerful or not. So you have to use a lot of math formulas for that. With video game testing, we often do, because we just get thousands and thousands and thousands of games. But basically, in your stuff, you have to very much work on mathematical models to see, is this going to be too strong or not? You don't control the DM, you don't control the player's skill. I can throw I would actually recommend have the same play group, or throw the exact same adventure into 3 different play groups. And some people think it's the most powerful thing ever. Some people will think it's the weakest thing ever because they'll run it differently, or they won't realize a trick, any number of stuff. So let me get to the more practical terms. First, when balancing for RNG, you have to understand sample size of 1. One of my favorite examples of this is in Lost Mines of Phandelver. Like, the chances that Clarg or some bugbear is going to kill a level 1 character are very low. But if it happens in your game, the chances retroactively are 100%. So
it doesn't matter if it doesn't happen in 99 out of 100 times. For your one table, you just killed someone's first character ever. They hate the game now.
Right. And that's 1 out of 100 odds in a game with millions.
Only time I've ever fudged in 5th edition, by the way.
Yes.
First session. Right.
And so 1 out of 100, when you have millions of players, is a lot of sad groups. So basically, you have to sort of look at, what are you willing to accept? Is the RNG outcome fun or crazy? Are there safeguards for it? Like, for example, in one of my systems I'm working on right now, every time you die, you come back stronger. And so actually, there are these really brutal deaths that can come out of nowhere, but you kind of get 4 to 5 resurrections before you die forever, based on some stuff I'm not going to get into. But basically, every time you come back, though, you escape death and you come back stronger and wiser for the experience. And so you get new powers, new abilities when you die, but you only get so many total like extra lives effectively. So there still feels like this cost. But bad players that make bad decisions or get unlucky, it's like a positive spiral until they totally, it's literally, it doesn't permanently kill me, it makes me stronger, but eventually it permanently kills you. So that ended up being a good solution. But one of the things I'll talk about RNG is it very much matters about, like, we almost need more terms, frankly. There's RNG of input and there's RNG of output, which are totally different things. RNG of input is all about giving you different options, but it's then your choice how to use those options. If we're going to talk about Hearthstone, discover is an example of RNG of input, or drafting an arena. And so you discover
roll for 2d6 goblins.
Yeah, and so basically, like saying roll a d6, here are 6 monsters, and each one, when you roll, the one you roll, you can use that or any of the 2 neighboring it on a table, something like that. And then you get to choose which of those 3 you want to use. That would be something similar for a DM as an example. Or something that he's saying, like, you roll on a table of spells you can do, and then you can do the thing above it or below it or the thing you're on. And that would be something similar to discover. And that is cool because it gives you different options every time you play, but it still gives you a choice on how to use those options or whether to use those options instead of another action. And so that's fun because role-playing games have a big problem of every combat you play, you kind of have the same options. And so they don't have a lot of that natural dynamic flow. Whereas in card games, like a Slay the Spire or Hearthstone or something, when you draw new cards, you get new options. And then when you play them, they leave your hand, so you can't spam them. And so there's a lot of good RNG of input that makes card games very popular. And I think we're going to see more and more card games linking in tabletop. RNG of output, though, is something like your example of 1d10 plus 2 damage. Now, in D&D, that's more accepted because you make so many rolls across so many players that it kind of just works anyway. Whereas often in Hearthstone or something, the difference between 11 damage and 2 damage on a single turn is going to turn the whole tide of the game. Because often you're only going to get like 6 total interactions between you and your opponent on a turn-to-turn basis, and not killing this creature now will put you on a permanent back foot. Because in Hearthstone, you were always building up, whereas in D&D, you're always getting whittled down. And so in D&D, there's no spiral of I didn't kill them fast enough, so therefore there's more monsters to deal with. It's just I didn't kill them fast enough, so we're taking some extra damage, but I'll kill them next turn.
All right. Wow. This is absolutely fascinating conversation. I hope we can do this again, but man, everybody, thank you, Dan. That was absolutely wonderful. This stream will be up for, You know what? You have anything you want to ask me before I sign off here?
I actually had a lot I wanted to ask you. We definitely have to do this again. But yeah, I just want to say, by the way, just for the record, I know I mentioned this to you before, your breakdown of the playtest notes and iterations of 5th edition is some of the best freaking design content I've ever seen in tabletop role-playing games. Just wonderful. I was so sad that you weren't able to justify doing the full thing. I understand why, but like, man, it was awesome. I watched that twice.
Oh man, that was a lot of work. What he's referring to is I did a complete breakdown of the D&D Next Fighter thing. I went through like all the playtest documents. I went through like all the Gen Con and Dragon Plus interviews. I went on to like the old the Wayback Machine to find articles that got taken down from Dragon Plus online, just to figure out exactly what's going on and how we ended up with this thing today. Because something that really bothers me is you'll go on to like internet forums and talk about like how stupid the designers were, how they don't know what they're talking about, and how they should have kept doing this. And what people don't really realize is the designers did exactly what the playtest asked them to do, right? You can hear those interviews like, well, this is a mechanic that I really liked. I thought was really cool, but it didn't test well with enough people, so we had to get rid of it. Or but people focus on one small problem, but really the designers are looking at a much larger global issue. That if we fix this one tiny thing, it's going to create a wider problem for everything else. So I don't know. In my opinion, the 5th edition playtest, it's something that turned a dying brand, right, into a cultural zeitgeist, right? Like it's going to be studied someday, I think, by some professional, how to reevaluate and how to revamp up a dying brand, how to reignite that loyalty with your customers.
I think that 5th edition, so I have many specific issues with 5th edition on many things, but I think the design challenge of it and the way they rose to meet it is shockingly brilliant. Like, a lot of people like to make fun of whatever the big brand is that gets literally, like, guys, if you've ever made your own homebrew stuff and you've shown like a small forum of like 20 people and they've spotted a major problem in it, try that, but by millions of people who literally, like freaking Zipperon, who literally lives just to tear down people's hopes and dreams of these designers. What I mean is like theorycraft people, who break down and say, is this too strong? How can we abuse this? How can we break this? Like, this is, we're thrilled that you guys do this. It's so wonderful. And it's so great to see people caring about this. And it's the job of a designer to like create a robust puzzle to solve. That's fun and engaging to solve and engage with. But the thing I really wanted to mention, I think that your point is brilliant, is like, this is really hard. And often things that seem obvious to you when you're designing were obvious to someone else as well. And the fact they didn't do it is an indication that there's actually a problem with it. Actually, I have a really funny quick story about that. I submitted a bunch of articles to Dragon Magazine once, and Chris Perkins wrote me back and said what was wrong with all of them. And that's awesome. Yeah, it was so fun. And some of the things I kind of disagreed with, but and some of the things I have since learned I was very wrong on. But basically, he basically said was, look, when we release, the fact that you've done all these articles that are nothing like anything published before is an indication that they're maybe not what we're looking for. Like, I know you're creative, but you should try to figure out why we like what we like and try to produce things that work within that. Don't just create something totally crazy and different. Like, that makes a lot of sense, because I don't think people realize just how much thought goes into these game design companies. People often think, hey, they decided it was too weak one day or too strong one day, so let's buff it or let's nerf it. It's like, no, that was the product of months of meetings, just months. And people were on the other side of those meetings, and they were very much against it. And some people were very much for it. And so there is no monolithic, unthinking thing. If anything, people go so deep, sometimes people can miss the highest level because they're so deep on the nittiest, grittiest thing of the equivalent of kerning, about this ability is great, but if we give it just one more line, it goes to the next page. We've got to cut a line somewhere. And that's really matters.
As someone who just put out a book, let me tell you will not believe how much design is a result of layout.
Yes. Anyway, I didn't mean to go on a whole other thing, but yeah, I think
that was great. This stream's going to be up for a while, and then I'm going to put it on my $1 Patreon. Make sure you check that out. Buy the book, Galder's Gazetteer. It's on Drive-Thru RPG. All the money's going to the Cancer Research Institute, and you'll get a lot of fun out of it. yeah, always, if you have some thoughts on this conversation, this great conversation, let me know in the comments below.